Hi, this is Tom Does Tech. I'm Tom, and in this video, we're going to be creating a full stack URL shortener app. So the URL shortener is going to be able to create a short URL through a user interface. You're going to be able to be redirected to a longer URL. It's going to track redirects, and it's going to be semi-production ready. On the back end, we're going to use Express, TypeScript, and MongoDB. And on the front end, we're going to use React, TypeScript, and Chakra UI. So this is an example of the application that we're going to be creating. So you can enter a long URL here, and we can create it, and then we get our short URL here, and it takes us to our destination. And then we have our analytics here, and we can see that this link was clicked at this time. So let's get started. I'm here in an empty directory, and I'm going to make one folder for the server. And I'm going to use Create React App to bootstrap the user interface. And we're just going to call that UI. So we've finished generating our user interface, and we can have a look. We have a folder for the server and a folder for the UI. So let's go into the server, and we can initiate TypeScript here with npx TypeScript and the init flag. And this will create a tsconfig file for you. So you can see there we have a tsconfig, and then we also need to initialize the project. And this will create a yarn init. So we call this server, say yes to all this. And we'll just create a source directory as well. And we will create an app, a app.ts inside the source folder. And we can open this up with our code editor. Okay, so we're going to build out our server before we start with the user interface. So we need to install a few dependencies here, so we can open up a terminal window. Add Express. What else will we need? Mongoose. And that's it for now. We can install the rest after. And there's also some dev dependencies we'll need. So we add types /express, types /node, TypeScript -d, and we can also add config. Perfect. So we can start building out our Express server. So we're going to have an endpoint for creating a short URL, and then we're going to have an endpoint for redirecting. So import Express from Express, and we'll also import the request and response types for that as well. And we'll create a new instance of Express. Sorry, we don't need to do that because it's just a function. And we can also set up config.json. And let me have a look at the config docs, so we can figure out what this JSON file should look like. Okay, so I think we can just make this a plain object. Okay, so let's delete the config.json file, and we'll make a directory called config. And then inside the config directory, we will do default.ts. Okay, so here's our config. And I think we can just export a default function from there. Let's see if we need to do any other. That should be okay. Let's set our port to port 4000. And then we can give this a go. Let's see if this actually worked. Import config from config. And we'll say app.listen config.get port. We might need to install the types for this as well. We do. So that's my config. And we'll give this a callback as well. So console.log app listening on localhost. And then we have our port, and I'll extract this into a variable because we're going to use it in a couple of different places. And we also need to set up a dev script. So let's have a look and see if we can find a good configuration for Node.js and TypeScript. So we'll look at this one. So apparently this one is the ultimate setup. So it must be good. Okay, let's go with this one. So we'll copy this, put this in a nodemon.json file. And then we'll come back to our scripts, and they have a dev script here. They also have one with an inspector, but we don't need that for now. So we'll just do this one, and we'll create our scripts. Dev, an extra. Yeah, and let's try this, yarn dev sourcing. So we've got to change this to app.ts. So config we need to change in here, doesn't look like it. Okay, so install TS node. TS node. Try this again, and the app is listening on port 4000. It looks like config worked as well. Awesome. So let's make a let our first endpoint be a health check, so we can hit that and make sure our API is up, and we can import from package. We should be able to import the version. So there's something in TypeScript. Import JSON. So let's see. Resolve JSON module. So let's see if that is in our. Okay, let's put it in. True. Let's see if we can import our package. We need to go back another, input our version. Perfect. So our health check is going to be app.get /health check. It's going to take a request and a response, and we can type those with our request and response objects. And we're just going to res.send, just say running version, and we'll put our version in here. So we'll put our version in here. Perfect. So let's go over to our browser and have a look at this endpoint. So we can see we're getting our cannot get. That's because we don't have a listener on the index. And if we go to health check, perfect, running version 1.0.0. Great, so let's now set up MongoDB and Mongoose. So inside our source folder, we'll create a new folder called models and one file called db.js. db, not debugger, db. And we're going to import Mongoose from Mongoose, and we're also going to import config from config. So I think this should be an async function. I'm sure we need to wrap this in a try catch, and we're going to say await mongoose dot connect, and we need to pass it a URI. So let's Google Mongoose connect. See if we can find an example of this URI. So here we go, my app. Perfect. So let's put this into a default config. Let's call it db and make it a string. And change this to URL shortener. Config.get. Let's change this to db URI. db.uri, config.get, db URI, and we're going to listen. This as is telling us, telling TypeScript that we want to use this variable as a string. So if we remove that, then it's going to give us what get will return. And that is type unknown, but it needs to be a string. So we can just say, create this constant as a string. And we'll just log that error for now. Perfect. So when our app is listening, we want to start our DB connection. And in here we can say, so let's see if this connect, I think we need to pass this option. Let's see if this connect, if we can use a callback with this. Looks like there's a dot catch, and so this connect is a promise, and so we can call, so we'll give this, and then we'll call dot then. We'll take the callback, db connected to. One thing to note about this, logging the DB connection string, if you have passwords in that connection string, you do not want to be logging that to the console or to any logging service. Let's also pass this use unified topology as well. Set that to true and see if we can get rid of that warning in the console. That could get quite annoying. Perfect. So we're connected to the database. Let's create our models now. So we're going to call this URL dot model.ts, import Mongoose from Mongoose, create a schema is equal to a new mongoose.schema, and the schema is just an object. And then we're going to export default. Now let's first let's not call a model URL, because if we export this as URL, we might get conflicts with the URL module from Node. So let's rename this to short URL, and then we can make our model short URL, and we're not going to have any problems. Model, and this takes 2 arguments. It's going to take our schema and the name, but I cannot remember in which order it does that. So we need to pass the name and then the schema. And we don't need to use the new function there. So this is going to have a couple of properties. The first one is going to be the short ID. That needs to be unique. And it's required. And then the second property is going to be the destination, which is required. So for this short ID, let's use nano ID. Nano ID. And we'll come over to nano ID. Have a look at this. So you can just import it and create it like this, but they're not that short. So let's create our own nano ID function. And I think there is a way to use this with Mongoose as well. Yeah, so we can set the default to a nano ID. Okay, so let's import this is going to be a custom alphabet equals custom alphabet, and then so this is going to take a string of characters, so we're just going to give it the alphabet A, B, C, D. And then I think it takes a length as well. Let's go back to the docs and look at this properly, how to do it. custom alphabet. That looks right. Okay. So the short ID, let's set that to default. Equal to a function that returns a nano ID. So let's also just double check that we do. That is how we do it. Yep, that is perfect. Great. Come back to our app and we can create our, actually let's create a controllers folder and we'll copy our short URL model name. Paste it in here, call this short URL controller. And we'll create a couple of functions in here. One is to create short URL. Function is get short URL. And these functions here, we can export these, are going to take a request and a response. And again, we can type those with the types that come from Mongoose. Sorry, not Mongoose, Express. Yeah, let's copy that, paste that there. So let's make a app.post / API / URL. And we're going to import our controller methods from and we can just pass these in like that. So the handler for this needs to be a star because we want to capture all URLs in here and then find their short URL and redirect them. So let's come back to our model. We can import our short URL model from let's extract the data out of the body. So we're going to require two things in the body of this. We're going to need the, sorry, we're only going to need one thing, the destination. And then we can create the short URL, and we'll make this an async function. I'm not sure what was happening there. And then we just want to send our short URL back and we'll return that. Okay, let's run our server again. And see that we have a couple of errors here. true is not a valid path. I'm not sure what is happening here. So the problem is here that we haven't actually given these a type. So we need to type these as string with a capital. Because we're using TypeScript, we can also create an interface here. So we can call this short URL. Sorry. Interface short URL. And our short URL is going to have a ID, which is going to be a string, short ID, sorry, a destination, which is going to be a string. This is going to extend document. Extends document, and we can pass that in to the model function and tell it what type of model we're going to be creating. Now, if we come back over here, we can see that this is type short URL, and we can see short URL dot, and we should get our properties here, short ID and destination. Perfect. So if we bring Postman in, we can make a post request to /API/URL, and this requires two things in the, one thing in the body, so destination, and that will be and if we send this request, we should expect to see our short URL coming back. And it looks like it's not responding because we have an error. Cannot read property destination of undefined. So the reason we have this error is because we need to express, use body parser. So we can install this here. And then in our app, import body parser from body parser. And we'll also need to install the type definitions for this. Sorry, body parser at and then after we create our app, we can app.use body parser. Start the server again. That is not the connection. Perfect. So let's come back to Postman, send this, and we have our short URL. Awesome. So let's have a look in Robo3T at short URL, and we can see this here. So I think this one here is probably a little bit too long. So let's create, what's wrong with this? Is there a different way that we should be using this? Without the options is deprecated apparently. And let's also create JSON. So let's change this to 6. And now let's do our get short URL handler. So we have this ID, and what we want to do is go to this ID and get redirected. So we need to get this segment from the URL. So let's Google Express get URL segment. Maybe the star is not the... Okay, maybe we should be doing... Yeah. And then I think in this will show up in the .params. Let's have a look at this. See what we have in here. And actually, let's res.send params, just so we're not getting an error anymore when we hit that route. Okay, so we're still getting an error. Maybe we need to put a slash in here. So we're not hitting this route here. Let's try the star and see what the params are. Whoa, no. So this is app.get, not a post route. That should solve our problem. Okay, and our params have the short ID. Perfect. So get that. And we need to find our short URL. Need to make this an async function. So find one by the short ID. And then we can res.redirect short URL dot destination, and we'll return that. What is wrong with this? If the short URL doesn't exist, let's return res.send status, and we'll return a 404 for that. And we can remove that. So now we'd expect to hit that route and redirect to Google. And that's exactly what happens. Perfect. So the next thing we want to do is add some analytics to this. So let's duplicate our short URL model, and we'll call this analytics. And we will create a count. Default is 0. Its type is going to be number. And the short URL is going to be type. So let's Mongoose reference another model. We'll find some syntax for this. So type mongoose.schema.objectID and it references the user. Perfect. So that's what we want. But in this case, we want to reference our short URL model. And let's make both of these required. Actually, let's change how we do this analytics. So all this would do is just increment once whenever our short URL is clicked. But what if we want to see when a short URL is being used? We'd want to create a instance of this whenever we hit the short URL. And that'll make it easier as well. So let's remove count and we'll add some timestamps true. And let's make this short URL is going to be of type short URL. And we can import this. Import short URL from short. So this is importing the interface. Yes, I did mean that. Export that. So we'll come back to our controller, we'll import our analytics model. And we'll create an instance of this. And our short URL is going to be the ID of this short URL. So let's come back, grab our ID, back to localhost port 4000/ID. Great. And then let's have a look in Robo3T and we should see some analytics in here. And there it is. And we should expect this short URL ID to be the same as this one, and it looks like it is. Awesome. So that is the UI, the server done. So let's come back to the terminal and we'll open the root of the monorepo in VS Code. Put that over. And we're going to start working on the UI now. So in the user interface, let's go to Chakra UI. And I've never actually used Chakra UI, but it looks exciting. So I'm going to have a go. So we need to install this. Open up the terminal. We're in the root of the monorepo now, so we need to cd into the user interface, install those. And let's have a look how we set this up. It looks like we just wrap our UI in a Chakra provider. And we're not using Next.js, so this looks like it should be good enough. And it looks like we can do it in the index.tsx. So let's import that here. Do that. We can get started by removing all this. And I think for this user interface, we're going to have something relatively simple, just a input that creates the short URL and then shows a link to the short URL. So let's create a new folder called components, and we'll make a new file called create short url.csx. Let's have a look at the inputs for Chakra UI. Okay, so there's basic input. We can make a large one. Okay, this looks good. We can prefix it with HTTPS. Looks like. Okay, this looks cool. Let's copy this. Actually, maybe we don't want to prefix it. Let's just use a normal input for now. And do they have some sample code for this? Yep, placeholder basic usage. So I'm going to return a fragment. Some text just says enter your URL. And give them an example. All right, let's start our server. Actually, sorry, let's install Axios first so we can make requests to our server application. Let's import Axios from Axios. And let's look at create React app environment variables. And how we can add environment variables. Okay, this looks simple enough. So we need to add one environment variable that is our server endpoint. And this is going to change because it's going to be localhost port 4000 on this application, but if you were to deploy this, it would be different. So let's have a look at our application. It's not ready yet. It'll be ready now. Okay, we need to render this create short URL form. So let's import and we can have a look at this. Perfect. So we also need a button to submit the form. That is the wrong button group. We just need one button. Okay, let's have a look. Perfect, we got our application, the button. Let's start creating our, let's interact with the API to create the short URL. So actually we're just going to use, because we only have one input, we're just going to use state. But if this was a bigger application that needed form validation and all sorts of stuff like that, we would use something like React Talk Forms or Formic to handle the form logic for us. And we'll just give this an onChange handler. And I assume this change handler has an event. That's right. Event.target.value. And just to double check that this is working, we're just going to render the value of destination, and we can see it's changing. Perfect. So let's create our handle submit function. This is going to use Axios, and we're going to post to our server endpoint. /API/URL. We're going to give it a body, and the body is just going to include destination. We'll make this an async function. And on click, actually, let's make this a proper form. And we can use that as a submit handler and give this a type, this button a type equals submit. And then on submit equals handle submit. And then so we're going to create our, when we get a result here, we're going to set the result. We're going to put the result into this short URL. And then we're just going to display this on the screen. And we need to JSON.stringify that. And let's set a couple of line breaks here so we can usually see what is going on our application. So the reason that this form redirected to this question mark is because we don't prevent, that is the default behavior of HTML. So we need to prevent default submit, and this is going to be a React. Yeah, so let's type this again. Let's have a look in the network panel and see why our URL is not being sent, and it looks like our server isn't even running. So bear with me. We'll start the server back up. And we can clear this and send it off again. Okay, and the error we're getting here is a cause error. So we need to set the access control allow origin. So the way we do that with Express, or the easiest way to do that with Express, is to install the cause module. So if we come back over to our server, we can import cause from cause. Type /cause and we can do app.use cause, and this will take a origin, and we want to set that origin in our config. So we'll come back over to our default config and we'll say cause origin. And then in our app, we can do config.get cause origin and start the server back up. And that will add this access control allow origin header, and our browser should be happy then. So let's see if that's worked. Perfect. We can see that header here, and it's created our short URL. So once we've created our short URL, we want to set the destination back to nothing, and we want to say you can click on this here. So let's type this actually. Let's copy this object here and say our short URL is going to be equal to this object. So the thing that we want out of here is just the short URL, which is going to be a string. Actually, let's set this to null. We say it's going to equal this object, or it's going to equal null. And then down here we can say short URL, render an anchor. And then the text of the anchor is going to be the server endpoint, because remember it's the server that does the redirecting. Short URL dot short ID, and that's also going to be the href. Great. Right, example.com. Then we can click on this and we get redirected to example.com. And that is a URL shortener that with a little bit of styling will be ready for production. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and like the video.